Did you set some goals at the beginning of the season and you just can't quite hit those numbers? Well, in this video, I'm going to share some tips on how to manage the wind on the golf course, and it can really help turn those windy rounds into maybe some of your best rounds ever if you just understand how to determine the impact of the wind on the shot that you're shooting. So stick around because that's what I'm going to cover today. But first off, I want to have a couple shout outs. First off, for my daughter, Catherine, thank you very much. She got me this custom Golf Nerd coffee mug. I absolutely love it, and I very much appreciate it. Secondly, the information I'm about to share with you today is from a podcast called Fit for Golf by Mike Carroll. He featured Marty Jertson, who is a supreme golf nerd who works for Ping. And Ping did a lot of studies to determine the effect of wind on a golf ball, and that's the information that I'm going to be sharing. I will link to the podcast below, but it's about an hour long, and I'm going to summarize this in about 10 minutes. But if you want to hear it straight from the man himself, well, see those links below and you'll be able to listen to the podcast. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is headwind. And the first thing I need to point out is that this is a non-linear relationship. Meaning, if you remember back in high school in like geometry or algebra, and you would plot out a line, the equation of a line is y equals mx plus b. And that gives a nice linear representation of some type of, condition. If you have one variable, you can solve for the other. But when it comes to wind affecting a golf ball, it's nonlinear. You just can't apply one multiplier times a value and come out with the correct information. So what Ping did was they said the best way to deal with this nonlinearity, but make it so it's easy to do on the course, is base everything off of your 7-iron. So I'm going to be talking about distances relative to my 7-iron, but I'll try to put it in terms of examples of higher speed 7-iron players as well, just so you can get a feel for how the math works. So let's just say I'm playing into a headwind of 10 miles an hour and I am playing straight into that wind. So if that's the case, then the effect of the wind on the golf ball is essentially 1% for every 1 mile per hour. And I'm really sorry there's so much outside noise. It was just such a pretty day I wanted to record outside. Anyway, so it's 1% per 1 mile per hour. Now, my 7-iron is typically around 150 yards. So let's say I'm playing into that 10 mile an hour headwind. 10% of 150 is 15 yards. So I'm going to use that 15 yards to calculate headwind distances across all clubs. So let's just say I'm hitting a 150 yard shot into a 10 mile an hour wind, and I say, okay, well, 10% of 150 is 15. I add that 15 to the 150 and I come up with 165 yards. So now it's no longer a 7-iron for me, but it's either a 6-iron or my 5 hybrid. I'm going to be falling in somewhere in that range right there for that specific distance. Now, if I was hitting a 120 yard shot into a 10 mile an hour wind, that would be my pitching wedge, but I would need to add that same 15 yards. So again, 150 yard 7-iron, 10% for a 10 mile an hour wind, 15 yards, that's where the 15's coming from. So that 120 yard shot, that would normally be my pitching wedge, but I'm playing into a 10 mile an hour wind, it's now 135 yards. And as a result of that, that's going to be a hard 9 or soft 8 for me. So that's how you figure out the headwind. If you have any questions about any of these topics, please leave it down below and I will discuss that with you personally. However, the other thing that a headwind does is it changes your dispersion, and it is 1% for every 1 mile an hour. So basically, let's say that you're playing into that same 10% or that 10 mile an hour wind, then that is going to provide a 10% greater dispersion. So think about dispersion as being a shotgun blast. So when you shoot a shotgun, you get more concentrations toward the center of your target, but you have outliers that form the big circle, and that's like your golf swing, that's like your golf shot. So anybody's dispersion is going to have somewhat of that shotgun pattern associated with it. So if it's still conditions and your shotgun pattern is this big, say it's 10 mile an hour now, playing into that 10 mile an hour wind, it's going to increase your dispersion by an additional 10%. It's easier to think about this in terms of the targets that you're trying to hit on the course though. So let's say you are playing into a 40-yard wide fairway and there's water off to both sides of that fairway. It's very tight, right? So if you're playing into that 10 mile an hour wind, that would be 10%. So what we would do is, instead of growing your dispersion by 10, you can shrink your target by 10, and then that'll tell you how big of a target you're actually going to be aiming at. So say again, 40-yard wide fairway, 10 mile an hour into the wind, headwind, so that's 10%. 10% of 40 is 4, so that 40-yard fairway would actually play like a 36-yard fairway. And that's a better way of thinking about it. Take the amount of wind, turn that into a percentage, and reduce the size of your target by that much, and then that'll help you understand, are you bringing hazards into play that you don't want to bring into play, like water, trees, etc. So dispersion and distance are both affected negatively, you could say, by a headwind. Next, we're going to talk about a tailwind, or the wind behind you. Okay, so now what I want to talk about is helping winds, or tailwinds that would push the ball. So it's not quite as simple as the headwind issue, because your swing speed will end up playing a factor in the calculation, and I'll get to that in a second. Ultimately, we're going to use that 7-iron distance still, because this is still a nonlinear issue, or a nonlinear equation, and as a result of that, this is what Ping found to be the best and easiest way to calculate these types of things just when you're on the course. So for slow swing speeds, you gain a 0.5% for every mile an hour. So go back to my 7-iron example. My 7-iron is 150 yards. Let's assume a 10 mile an hour helping wind. So if I'm going to gain 0.5% for every 1 mile an hour, and it's 10 miles an hour, then I'm going to gain 5%. 5 is half of 10. That's where that's coming from. So 5% of my 7-iron distance would be 150 times 10% would be 15. Divide that by 2, that's the 5%, and that's 7.5. My typical drive is 230 yards. So if we add that 7.5 yards from a 10 mile an hour helping wind, then that 230-yard drive would now go 237.5 would be the math. But obviously it's dependent on how well you hit the ball. Now as your swing speed increases, you get closer to 1% for every 1 mile an hour. Okay, so let's walk through an example. If you're a high-speed player, let's say you hit your drives around 300 yards, so you're swinging 115-ish type speeds on the golf course. Your 7-iron, let's just say for easy math, let's just say it goes 200 yards. Okay, so if it's a 10 mile an hour helping wind, and because of your speed, you're going to gain 1% for every 1 mile an hour, and you have a 200-yard 7-iron, then 10% of that would be 20 yards. So add that 20 yards to your 300-yard drive, and now your 300-yard drive is going to become a 320-yard drive. See how that works? So that helping wind, again, for average or slower swing speeds, it's going to be around 0.5% of your 7-iron distance for every 1 mile an hour. But if you are a higher swing speed player, say around that 115 or thereabouts with a driver, then it's going to be more like 1% for every 1 mile an hour, and you can go through those examples. Now, what I said before about dispersion was a headwind affected the dispersion by 1% for every 1 mile an hour. So as a result of that, when you are playing with a tailwind, it actually helps your dispersion 1% for every 1 mile an hour. So imagine if you've got wind blowing from behind you, that wind is going to try to make the ball go straight. So if you put a little bit of curve on that ball, it's going to try to funnel it back towards the center again, because the forces are trying to push it down the fairway, kind of a thing, down that straight line from behind you. So again, it's 1% narrower. So if you really want to go for something, you can have a little bit more confidence knowing that because you have a helping wind, it's actually going to reduce your dispersion by 1% for every 1 mile an hour. So again, let's talk about the example I talked to earlier. So say it's a 40-yard wide fairway, and it's got a 10 mile an hour helping wind, and it's that 1% of help in terms of dispersion per mile an hour. So we would see a 10% improvement in dispersion. Now that 40-yard fairway, because of the helping wind, is really going to play like a 44-yard fairway, which is a very different animal. You know, I mean, you're gaining some distance there, so it allows you to be more aggressive when you're playing downwind. Finally, let's talk about crosswinds. Crosswinds are really easy as long as it's like a 90 degree. So if you've got a hard left or hard right wind, for every 1 mile an hour of wind, it's going to move the target 1 yard opposite the direction of the wind. So let me say that in a different way. I am playing a 150-yard shot. I've got a 10 mile an hour left to right wind, and the flag is in the dead center of the green. Okay, so normally I would aim at the dead center of the green for that flag, but I've got this left to right 10 mile an hour wind. Because of that, every 1 mile an hour equals 1 yard of offset to be able to anticipate the amount that the wind is going to move that ball while it's in the air. Meaning, I've got that 150-yard shot. I'm aimed at the green, or at the flag in the center of the green, but because I've got a left to right wind of 10 miles an hour, I'm actually going to aim 10 yards to the left of that flag. That 10-yard left, as long as the wind's blowing 10 mile an hour when I hit the ball, it's going to move that ball the 10 yards, and if I hit a perfect shot on that line, it's going to end up right on the flag. So that's how you play crosswinds. Now, when it starts to angle and things of that nature, there are obviously going to be differences. So you just have to try to figure out, you know, if it's, say, a 45-degree angle, maybe you use half of that crosswind kind of approach. Or say you've got a slight crosswind, headwind effect, you're going to need to derate what I'm saying right now, because I'm talking about perfectly into the wind, or perfect tailwind directly behind you, or a 90-degree crosswind. So as those angles change, that's going to affect how much these things are going to move the ball. But another thing that's going to change is the fact that wind is never constant. You know, it is always rising and lowering. So you just kind of got to take some estimations. It's not a perfect science, but if you're not using this type of calculation to figure out your distances of your shots today, I guarantee you that this is going to be so much closer than anything else you've been doing. I've been using this for the last couple of years since I listened to this podcast, and when I get into windy conditions, I'm usually pretty close to where I want to be. So I know that the system works, and it's certainly helped me. But like I said, we're not trying to put a man on the moon here. This is not precise. This is estimations that will help you get closer so that you don't have wildly crazy either long or short shots relative to your targets. So just keep these figures in mind. And again, if you have any questions at all about any of these specifics that I've mentioned, just ask me below and I'd be happy to try to clarify anything that I probably screwed up during the course of trying to get all this information out in a video. So hopefully this is very helpful. If you do like this type of content, please hit the like button because it lets me know what type of information you all are looking for. There's so many different reviews on so many different products, and I like to do some of that stuff too. But sometimes there's just some information that I come across and I think, boy, people could really use this information. It could really help them on the course, and that's why I wanted to make this particular video. Well, that's it for the Golf Nerd. Hit them long and straight, and I'll see you next time.